Prince Harry had always been a man of contradictions. To the world, he was the charming royal with a mischievous smile. But behind closed doors, his life was a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. On this particular day, as he walked through the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, his mind buzzed with thoughts that refused to settle. The palace, with its towering ceilings and intricate gold detailing, felt more like a museum than a home. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of duty, tradition, and the unyielding weight of the crown. Harry's footsteps echoed softly against the polished marble floors as he made his way toward the main entrance. His visit today wasn't part of any official schedule. It was personal. He needed time away from meetings, media appearances, and the constant scrutiny that came with being a member of the British royal family. But no matter how far he tried to distance himself mentally, the shadow of the monarchy loomed over him. Questions about loyalty, identity, and purpose gnawed at him relentlessly. As he approached the massive wooden doors leading outside, his attention was drawn to a figure standing perfectly still near the gate. It was one of the royal guards, dressed in the iconic scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat. The guard stood tall, his posture impeccable, exuding an aura of unwavering discipline. For a moment, Harry simply observed him. There was something almost otherworldly about the scene. The contrast between the vibrant red uniform and the muted elegance of the palace backdrop created a picture-perfect image. Yet beneath the surface, Harry couldn't help but wonder, what did this man really think? Did he believe in the crown he swore to protect? Curiosity got the better of him. Harry decided to approach the guard, his steps slow and deliberate. As he drew closer, he noticed the subtle details, the shine of the brass buttons on the tunic, the precision of the white gloves covering the guard's hands, and the faint sheen of sweat under the heavy bearskin hat. Despite the heat, the guard didn't move a muscle. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, focused on some invisible point in the distance. "Do you truly believe in what this crown stands for?" Harry asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence like a pebble dropped into a still pond. The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. It wasn't accusatory, nor was it casual. It carried a hint of skepticism, as though Harry himself wasn't entirely sure what answer he wanted to hear. For a brief second, the guard's expression didn't change. His face remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. Protocol dictated that he remain silent unless addressed directly by a senior royal or given permission to speak. But something in Harry's tone, perhaps the raw honesty behind it, prompted the guard to respond. After a pause that felt longer than it actually was, the guard spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and devoid of any defensiveness. "Your Highness," he began, his words carefully chosen, "my loyalty is not blind faith. It's a choice I make every day when I put on this uniform." The response caught Harry off guard. He hadn't expected such a thoughtful reply, especially not from someone whose role often painted them as mere symbols rather than individuals with opinions. Intrigued, Harry took a step closer, studying the guard's face. There was no arrogance, no hesitation, just quiet confidence. "You're saying your loyalty isn't automatic?" Harry pressed, his curiosity piqued. What if the crown fails to live up to its promises? What if it doesn't serve its people the way it should? The guard tilted his head ever so slightly, as if considering the question before answering. "Then my role becomes even more vital," he said firmly. "To uphold tradition while reminding those who wear the crown of their responsibilities." These words struck a chord deep within Harry. They weren't just a defense of the monarchy. They were a reflection of the very principles he had once held dear, but now found himself struggling to reconcile with his own choices. He thought back to his early years, when he had been eager to embrace his royal duties, to be the prince everyone expected him to be. But over time, disillusionment had crept in. The rigid rules, the lack of privacy, and the feeling of being trapped in a gilded cage had pushed him to seek freedom elsewhere. Yet here was this guard, a stranger in many ways, reminding him of the ideals he had once believed in. Loyalty, responsibility, service. These weren't empty words. They were pillars upon which the monarchy rested. And perhaps, Harry realized. They were also the keys to understanding his own internal conflict. He continued to stare at the guard, searching for signs of doubt or uncertainty. But there was none. The man stood as solid as the palace walls around them, embodying a sense of purpose that Harry envied. In that moment, Harry understood that loyalty wasn't about blindly following orders or adhering to outdated traditions. It was about finding meaning in what you do, even when the path is difficult. Without another word, Harry nodded slightly, acknowledging the guard's perspective. Then, turning on his heel, he walked away, leaving the guard to resume his silent vigil. As he moved further down the corridor, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. The conversation had been brief, but its impact lingered, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his relationship with the crown. For the first time in a long while, Harry allowed himself to reflect, not on what others expected of him, but on what he truly believed in. Was his decision to step back from royal duties driven by courage or selfishness? Had he abandoned his responsibilities, or had he simply sought a different way to serve? These questions swirled in his mind as he disappeared into the depths of the palace, leaving the guard and the echoes of their exchange behind. The guard, whose nameplate read Corporal James Whittaker, didn't flinch at Prince Harry's sudden and probing question. His training had prepared him for countless scenarios, handling unruly crowds, maintaining composure during high stakes events, and even enduring the biting cold of a British winter while standing perfectly still. But this was different. It wasn't a logistical challenge or a physical test. It was deeply personal, almost philosophical. Yet Corporal Whittaker remained unfazed, his expression calm and composed as he processed Harry's words. Harry's question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with implications. Do you truly believe in what this crown stands for? It wasn't just idle curiosity. It carried weight, perhaps even frustration. Whittaker could sense the underlying tension in Harry's tone, the unspoken conflict between duty and disillusionment. For a brief moment, the corporal wondered if Harry was projecting his own doubts onto him, seeking validation or reassurance. Whatever the case, Whittaker knew he couldn't afford to be dismissive. This was no ordinary conversation. It was an opportunity to share his perspective, to offer clarity, or maybe even to bridge the gap between two vastly different worlds. My loyalty is not blind faith, Whittaker replied after a thoughtful pause, his voice steady but warm. It's a choice I make every day when I put on this uniform. The simplicity of his response seemed to catch Harry off guard. He had expected something rehearsed, something polished and diplomatic. Instead, Whittaker's words were raw, honest, and refreshingly human. There was no pretense, no attempt to sugarcoat reality. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of the truth. Loyalty wasn't something inherited or forced upon him. It was earned, nurtured, and reaffirmed daily. Harry tilted his head slightly, intrigued. A choice? He repeated, his brow furrowing. What happens when that choice becomes harder to make? When the crown doesn't seem to live up to its promises? Whittaker exhaled softly, though his posture remained rigid. He understood the subtext of Harry's question, the implication that the monarchy might be flawed, imperfect, or out of touch. He himself had wrestled with similar thoughts during quiet moments late at night, when the palace was silent and the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him. But unlike Harry, who had chosen to step away from the institution entirely, Whittaker had made peace with the imperfections. To him, the crown wasn't a monolith of perfection. It was a living, breathing entity, shaped by history, tradition, and the people who served it. If the crown falters, Whittaker said slowly, choosing each word with care, then my role becomes even more vital, to uphold tradition while reminding those who wear the crown of their responsibilities. His gaze softened slightly, though his eyes remained fixed, straight ahead. It was a subtle reminder that loyalty wasn't just about following orders, it was about holding others accountable too. Even kings and princes weren't exempt from scrutiny. Harry blinked, taken aback by the depth of Whittaker's insight. The guard's reply wasn't defensive or evasive. It was constructive, almost poetic. In those few sentences, Whitaker had managed to encapsulate everything Harry had been grappling with for years, the delicate balance between honoring tradition and pushing for change. Loyalty, as Whitaker described it, wasn't about blindly adhering to the status quo. It was about staying true to one's values while navigating the complexities of an evolving world. Reminding them of their responsibilities, Harry murmured, under his breath, letting the phrase sink in. He thought back to his own journey, the highs and lows, the triumphs and missteps. As a young prince, he had once believed wholeheartedly in the monarchy's mission to serve the people. He had thrown himself into charitable work, advocated for causes close to his heart, and tried to use his platform for good. But over time, the cracks had begun to show. The relentless media scrutiny, the suffocating protocols, and the feeling of being boxed in had chipped away at his idealism. By the time he decided to step back from royal duties, he had convinced himself that leaving was the only way to stay true to who he was. Yet here was Whitaker, embodying a completely different approach. Rather than walking away from the challenges, the corporal leaned into them. He embraced the flaws of the system he served, not because he condoned them, but because he believed he could help shape its future. His loyalty wasn't passive. It was active, dynamic, and purposeful. And in that moment, Harry realized how much he had underestimated men like Whitaker. They weren't just symbols of authority or relics of a bygone era. They were individuals, with convictions, dreams, and struggles of their own. "What keeps you going?" Harry asked suddenly, his voice softer now, tinged with genuine curiosity. "After everything, the long hours, the sacrifices, the pressure, what makes it worth it?" Whitaker hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. It was a question he had asked himself many times, especially during the darkest days of his service. "Purpose," he said finally, his tone firm yet reflective. "Knowing that what I do matters, not just to me but to others. Whether it's protecting the royal family, representing our country, or simply being a symbol of stability in uncertain times, there's meaning in it. That's what keeps me grounded." His words resonated deeply with Harry. Purpose, that elusive concept he had spent years chasing. Wasn't that why he had left the royal fold in the first place? To find fulfillment outside the confines of tradition? And yet, listening to Whitaker, Harry began to wonder if purpose wasn't something external, something tied to specific roles or titles. Maybe it was internal, rooted in the choices we make and the values we uphold, regardless of our circumstances. As the conversation continued, Harry found himself drawn to Whitaker's perspective. The guard spoke of sacrifice, not as a burden, but as a privilege. He talked about discipline, not as a restriction, but as a form of freedom. And he emphasized resilience, not as a means to endure hardship, but as a way to grow stronger through. Each idea challenged Harry's preconceived notions, forcing him to reevaluate his own beliefs. At one point, Whitaker shared a story, a memory from his early days in the military. He recounted how he had stood guard outside a hospital where injured soldiers were recovering. One of them, a young man missing a leg, had thanked Whitaker profusely for his service. "You're the reason we can sleep soundly at night," the soldier had said. Those words had stayed with Whitaker ever since, fueling his determination to carry on despite the difficulties. "That's what loyalty means to me," Whitaker concluded. "Not perfection, but perseverance. Not blind allegiance, but unwavering commitment." Harry listened intently, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions. For so long he had viewed loyalty as a constraint, a chain binding him to expectations he couldn't meet. But Whitaker's interpretation painted a different picture, one of strength, integrity, and purpose. Loyalty wasn't about losing yourself. It was about finding your place within something larger than yourself. As the exchange drew to a close, Harry felt a strange mix of admiration and introspection. He had come to the palace seeking answers, but instead he had found questions that would linger long after the conversation ended, questions that would force him to confront not just the crown, but also his own identity. Without another word, Harry nodded respectfully, his gaze lingering on Whitaker for a moment longer before he turned and walked away. Behind him, the guard resumed his post, steadfast and resolute, a living testament to the power of conviction. And as Harry disappeared into the palace corridors, he couldn't help but feel that something profound had shifted within him. Harry's mind was a whirlwind as he processed Corporal Whitaker's words. The guard's perspective had struck a chord deep within him, but it also stirred up memories and emotions he had long tried to suppress. Loyalty wasn't blind allegiance. It was purposeful commitment. Sacrifice wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. These ideas sounded noble in theory, but Harry couldn't help but feel conflicted. Wasn't his decision to step away from royal duties also an act of loyalty? Hadn't he chosen to prioritize his family's well-being over the rigid expectations of the monarchy? Or was he simply running away from challenges he didn't know how to face? As these questions swirled in his head, Harry found himself pacing along the palace corridors. He stopped near a large window overlooking the gardens, where sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground below. For a moment he allowed himself to breathe, letting the tranquility of the scene calm his racing thoughts. But the calm didn't last long. His internal debate reignited as he replayed snippets of his conversation with Whitaker. What if the crown falters? Harry muttered aloud, almost as if challenging an invisible opponent. What if it no longer serves its people the way it should? It wasn't just a hypothetical question. It was a reflection of his own disillusionment. Over the years, he had witnessed firsthand the cracks in the system, the outdated traditions that alienated younger generations, the relentless media scrutiny that turned personal lives into public spectacles, and the growing disconnect between the monarchy and the diverse communities it claimed to represent. To Harry, stepping back hadn't been an act of betrayal. It had been an attempt to find a new way to serve, one that aligned more closely with his values and vision for the future. But Whitaker's response kept echoing in his mind. Then my role becomes even more vital, to uphold tradition while reminding those who wear the crown of their responsibilities. Those words carried a weight Harry couldn't ignore. They implied accountability, not just from the institution itself, but from the individuals within it. And perhaps, Harry realized, he had failed in that regard. By leaving, had he abdicated not only his title but also his responsibility to advocate for change from within? The thought unsettled him. He had always prided himself on being different from the rest of the royal family, more relatable, more progressive, more willing to break free from convention. Yet now, standing alone in the quiet grandeur of Buckingham Palace, he wondered if his departure had been less about courage and more about avoidance. Had he taken the easy way out, choosing freedom over the hard work of reforming the very system he criticized? Determined to confront these doubts, Harry returned to the entrance hall where Whitaker still stood guard. This time, however, there was no hesitation in his approach. "Corporal Whitaker," he said firmly, catching the guard's attention, "you mentioned holding the crown accountable. What does that look like to you?" Whitaker blinked, momentarily surprised by Harry's return. Protocol dictated that he remain stoic, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Your Highness," he replied evenly, "accountability takes many forms. Sometimes it's speaking truth to power, other times it's leading by example, or simply staying committed when others might walk away." "Staying committed," Harry echoed, his voice trailing off. The phrase hit uncomfortably close to home. He thought about his mother, Princess Diana, whose compassion and determination had redefined what it meant to be royal. She hadn't walked away from her struggles. She had faced them head-on, using her platform to shine a light on issues often ignored by the establishment. Her legacy was proof that change was possible, even within the confines of tradition. "And what happens when staying committed feels impossible?" Harry pressed, his tone tinged with vulnerability. "When the weight of expectation becomes too much to bear?" Whitaker hesitated, sensing the raw emotion behind Harry's question. "I won't pretend it's easy, Your Highness," he admitted. "There are days when the uniform feels heavier than usual, when doubt creeps in and makes you question everything. But I remind myself why I started this journey in the first place. I think about the people counting on me, the soldiers I've served alongside, the families I've protected, the ideals I've sworn to uphold. That's what keeps me going. His words resonated deeply with Harry, though they also stung. He thought about the countless hours he had spent agonizing over his place in the monarchy, torn between his duty to the crown and his desire for independence. In the end, he had chosen the latter, believing it was the only path forward. But, hearing Whittaker speak so passionately about perseverance made him wonder, had he given up too soon? Could he have stayed and fought for the changes he believed in, rather than stepping aside entirely? Before Harry could respond, Whittaker added, softly, "It's not about perfection, Your Highness. It's about progress. Even small steps can make a difference if they're taken with sincerity and purpose." Progress. The word lingered in Harry's mind, sparking a glimmer of hope amidst the turmoil. Perhaps loyalty wasn't an all-or-nothing proposition. Maybe it was possible to honor tradition while pushing for evolution, to balance respect for the past with a vision for the future. After all, wasn't that what his mother had done? She had embraced her role as a princess while challenging the status quo, proving that one could be both a custodian of history and a catalyst for change. Inspired by this realization, Harry decided to probe further. "Tell me something, Corporal Whittaker," he said, his tone earnest. "Do you ever feel trapped by your uniform, like it defines you in ways you don't want to be defined?" For the first time since their conversation began, Whittaker allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. "Of course, Your Highness," he admitted candidly. "There are moments when I wish I could shed the uniform and just be James. But then I remind myself that the uniform isn't who I am. It's what I do. It's a tool, a symbol, a means to an end. And if I use it wisely, it can amplify my voice instead of silencing it." Harry nodded slowly, absorbing the guard's wisdom. There was a profound simplicity in Whittaker's outlook, a recognition that identity and purpose weren't mutually exclusive. One could embrace the constraints of a role without letting them consume one's spirit. It was a lesson Harry desperately needed to hear, especially at this crossroads in his life. As the two men stood there, separated by rank and circumstance, yet united by a shared sense of introspection, Harry felt a shift within himself. He had come to the palace seeking clarity, but instead he had discovered complexity. Loyalty, sacrifice, accountability. These concepts weren't black and white. They existed in shades of gray, requiring nuance and understanding. And perhaps, Harry realized, that was the beauty of it. Life wasn't about finding easy answers. It was about wrestling with difficult questions and emerging stronger for it. With a final nod of gratitude, Harry stepped back, allowing Whittaker to resume his silent vigil. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that their exchange had planted a seed, a spark of possibility that would continue to grow in the days and weeks to come. For the first time in a long while, Harry felt a renewed sense of purpose. Not as a prince bound by tradition, but as a man determined to forge his own path while honoring the legacy of those who came before him. As Harry stepped away from Corporal Whittaker, his mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The guard's words had planted seeds of doubt, not about the man himself, but about Harry's own decisions and beliefs. He wandered through the palace, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors, each step accompanied by the weight of introspection. The grandeur of Buckingham Palace, its towering chandeliers, ornate tapestries, and sprawling hallways, had always felt like a gilded prison to him. But now, for the first time in years, he saw it differently. It wasn't just a relic of tradition. It was a living entity shaped by the people who served it, protected it, and believed in it. Harry found himself drawn to a quiet alcove near the palace library. The room was dimly lit, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the walls. He sat down on a plush chair, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. His thoughts raced as he replayed Whittaker's stories and insights. The corporal had spoken of soldiers thanking him for his service, of finding purpose in sacrifice, and of using his role to remind others of their responsibilities. These weren't just abstract ideas, they were lived experiences, grounded in moments of courage and conviction, and yet, Harry couldn't help but wonder, could he have done the same? Could he have stayed within the system and used his position to drive change, rather than stepping away entirely? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had underestimated men like Whittaker. To Harry, the Royal Guards had always seemed like silent sentinels, symbols of an institution that often felt distant and rigid. But Whittaker's humanity had shattered that perception. Behind the uniform was a man with dreams, struggles, and a deep sense of duty. A man who chose to serve not because he was forced to, but because he believed in the ideals the crown represented, even if those ideals were imperfect. This realization hit Harry hard. For so long he had viewed loyalty as a burden, a chain that bound him to expectations he couldn't meet. But Whittaker had reframed it entirely. Loyalty, according to the corporal, wasn't about blind obedience or stifling one's individuality. It was about finding meaning within the structure you've chosen to serve. It was about holding others accountable while staying true to your values. And perhaps most importantly, it was about perseverance, not giving up when things got tough, but digging deeper and pushing forward. Harry thought back to his mother, Princess Diana, whose legacy loomed large over everything he did. She had faced immense challenges during her time as a royal, scrutiny, betrayal, heartbreak, but she had never wavered in her commitment to her causes. Whether it was advocating for HIV/AIDS awareness, supporting landmine victims, or simply showing compassion to those society had forgotten, Diana had used her platform to make a difference. She hadn't walked away from the monarchy. She had worked within it, even when it resisted her efforts. Her courage and resilience had inspired millions, including her own sons. Wasn't that what Harry had once aspired to do? Hadn't he dreamed of carrying on her legacy, of using his royal title to champion the underrepresented and challenge outdated norms? Somewhere along the way, though, he had convinced himself that leaving was the only way to honor her memory. He had told himself that stepping back would allow him to live authentically, to protect his family from the toxicity of media scrutiny, and to build a life outside the constraints of the palace. But now, sitting in this quiet alcove, he began to question whether that decision had been driven by courage or fear. Fear of failure, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing himself in the process. These fears had haunted him for years, shaping his choices and clouding his judgment. But listening to Whittaker, Harry realized something profound. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to act despite it. Staying committed didn't mean ignoring the flaws of the system, it meant confronting them head-on, using your voice and influence to create change from within. With this newfound clarity, Harry reflected on his own journey. When he had announced his decision to step back from royal duties, the world had reacted with a mix of shock, admiration, and criticism. Some praised him for prioritizing his mental health and family, while others accused him of abandoning his responsibilities. At the time, he had dismissed the negative reactions as unfair and short-sighted, but now he wondered if there was truth in their criticisms. Had he taken the easy way out? Had he shied away from the hard work of reforming the monarchy, choosing instead to start anew? These questions weren't easy to face, but Harry knew they were necessary. Growth rarely came without discomfort, and he owed it to himself and to his mother's memory to confront them honestly. As he sat there in the alcove, he allowed himself to imagine an alternate path. What if he had stayed? What if he had leaned into the challenges, using his position to advocate for modernization and transparency within the royal family? Could he have made a difference? Or would the resistance have been too overwhelming? The answers weren't clear, and perhaps they never would be. But one thing was certain. Harry's decision to leave hadn't been black and white. It had been a complex blend of love, frustration, hope, and fear. And while he couldn't undo the past, he could learn from it. He could take the lessons he had gleaned from Whittaker and apply them to his future, whether that meant continuing to build a life outside the monarchy or finding new ways to contribute to its evolution. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the palace walls, Harry rose from his seat. He felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acknowledgement that growth often required revisiting old wounds and re-examining past choices. He wasn't the same man he had been before this conversation with Whitaker. Something inside him had shifted, a subtle but significant recalibration of his perspective. Walking back toward the entrance hall, Harry spotted Whitaker still standing guard, as steadfast as ever. The corporal's presence was a reminder of the strength that came from purposeful commitment. Though their worlds were vastly different, they shared a common thread. Both were navigating the complexities of identity and responsibility in their own ways. And perhaps Harry thought that was the key to understanding loyalty, not as a rigid obligation but as a dynamic force that evolved with time and experience. As Harry approached Whitaker once more, he offered a small, respectful nod. There was no need for words. The exchange between them had already said enough. Turning away, Harry left the palace, his mind clearer than it had been in months. He didn't have all the answers, nor did he expect to find them overnight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Not because he had resolved his internal conflict, but because he had begun to embrace it. Sometimes the hardest questions don't lead to definitive answers. Instead, they open doors to new possibilities, inviting us to grow, adapt, and redefine our place in the world. And for Harry, that was enough for now. The sun was beginning to set as Prince Harry stepped out of Buckingham Palace, the golden rays casting long shadows across the courtyard. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the approaching evening, and for a moment, Harry paused to take it all in, the grandeur of the palace behind him, the quiet determination of the guards standing watch, and the distant hum of London life beyond the gates. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times before, yet today, it felt different. Today, it resonated with a deeper meaning, one that had been stirred by his unexpected conversation with Corporal James Whitaker. As he walked away from the palace, Harry's mind replayed the exchange like a film on repeat. Whitaker's words, thoughtful, measured, and profoundly human, had left an indelible mark on him. Loyalty wasn't blind faith. It was a conscious choice made every day. Sacrifice wasn't a burden. It was a privilege born out of purpose. Accountability wasn't a critique. It was a reminder of shared responsibility. These ideas weren't revolutionary, but they were transformative when viewed through the lens of honesty and self-reflection. For Harry, they had sparked a shift, a subtle but significant recalibration of how he saw himself, his role, and the institution he had once been a part of. He found himself drawn to St. James's Park, a place where he had often sought solace during turbulent times. The park was alive with activity despite the fading light. Couples strolled hand in hand along the paths, children laughed as they chased ducks near the lake, and joggers weaved past benches occupied by people lost in thought or conversation. It was a microcosm of life itself, chaotic yet harmonious, unpredictable yet beautiful. As Harry sat on a bench overlooking the water, he realized how much he had craved this simplicity after years of living under the microscope of royal expectations. But simplicity didn't mean clarity. If anything, his thoughts were more tangled than ever. On one hand, he felt a renewed sense of admiration for those who stayed within the system, choosing to serve despite its imperfections. Men like Whitaker embodied resilience, finding strength in their convictions even when faced with adversity. They reminded Harry of his mother, Princess Diana, whose unwavering compassion and courage had inspired millions. She hadn't walked away from her struggles. She had confronted them head-on, using her platform to shine a light on issues others ignored. Her legacy was proof that change was possible, even within the confines of tradition. On the other hand, Harry couldn't dismiss the reasons that had led him to step back from royal duties. The relentless media scrutiny, the suffocating protocols, and the feeling of being boxed into a role he no longer identified with had taken a toll on his mental health and strained his relationships. Leaving hadn't been easy, but staying would have meant sacrificing pieces of himself he wasn't willing to lose. At the time, it had seemed like the only way forward, a chance to reclaim his identity and build a life rooted in authenticity rather than obligation. Yet now, sitting amidst the tranquility of the park, Harry began to see another possibility. Perhaps loyalty wasn't an either-or proposition. Maybe it was possible to honor tradition while pushing for evolution, to balance respect for the past with a vision for the future. His decision to leave hadn't necessarily been wrong, but it also hadn't been the end of the story. Life was rarely so black and white. Instead, it existed in shades of gray, requiring nuance, patience, and adaptability. And perhaps Harry realized that was the beauty of it. Growth wasn't about arriving at definitive answers. It was about embracing the journey, the questions, the doubts, and the moments of clarity that came along the way. As the sky turned, shades of orange and pink, Harry allowed himself to imagine what lay ahead. He thought about the causes he cared deeply about: mental health awareness, veteran support, environmental sustainability, and how he could continue advocating for them outside the monarchy. But he also considered whether there might still be room for collaboration, however small, with the institution he had left behind. Change didn't happen overnight, and progress often required persistence. Could he find ways to contribute without compromising his values? Could he use his experiences to bridge gaps rather than widen them? These possibilities filled him with a cautious optimism. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that growth rarely came without discomfort. What mattered most was staying true to himself while remaining open to new perspectives. That was something Whitaker had taught him, not through lectures or platitudes, but through quiet conviction and lived experience. By the time the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Harry had reached a fragile but meaningful resolution. He didn't need to have all the answers right away. What he needed was to trust the process, to embrace the uncertainty and allow himself to evolve. Stepping away from royal duties hadn't erased his connection to the crown. It had simply redefined it. And perhaps in time, he could forge a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a commitment to serving others in whatever capacity he chose. Rising from the bench, Harry took one last look at the serene landscape before heading home. The weight on his shoulders hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging the complexity of his emotions had given him permission to breathe again. He thought about Whitaker, still standing guard at the palace gates, steadfast and resolute. Their worlds were vastly different, yet their shared humanity connected them in ways neither could have anticipated. In that brief encounter, they had exchanged not just words, but truths that challenged, inspired, and ultimately transformed. That night, as Harry settled into his quarters, he picked up a pen and opened a journal. For the first time in months, he felt compelled to write, not to vent or lament, but to reflect. He wrote about his conversation with Whitaker, capturing the essence of what had transpired between them. He wrote about his mother, whose legacy continued to guide him even in her absence. And he wrote about himself, not as a prince bound by tradition, nor as a man seeking escape, but as someone determined to navigate the gray areas of life with courage and integrity. When he finally closed the journal, Harry felt a sense of peace wash over him. The questions that had plagued him for so long hadn't vanished, but they no longer felt insurmountable. They were part of the tapestry of his life, threads woven together to create a story uniquely his own. And though the ending remained unwritten, he was ready to face whatever came next, with humility, hope, and an unshakable belief in the power of purpose. For in the end, loyalty wasn't about perfection. It was about perseverance. It was about finding meaning in the choices we make and the values we uphold, regardless of our circumstances. And as Harry drifted off to sleep, he knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over, but it was worth taking.